Now, as Kate just reported there, a referendum is planned on Sunday in Donetsk. But unlike Crimea, citizens won't be asked whether they want to join Russia. Instead, they'll be asked if they support the creation of an independent Donetsk People's Republic. Later this month, presidential elections are planned to vote for a formal replacement for ousted President Viktor Yanukovych, who fled the capital in February. Well, joining us now is Stephen Pifer. He served as U.S. ambassador to Ukraine during the Clinton administration and is currently a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution right here in Washington, D.C. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Now, as we heard from our reporter, the fighting is escalating in eastern Ukraine. Is there a danger right now that this could spiral into an all-out civil war?
Well, I think there is that risk. I mean, for the last several weeks, the government in Kyiv has faced this very difficult dilemma. On the one hand, do they take action against these groups that have seized government buildings and television stations at locations in eastern Ukraine and risk either hurting people or perhaps giving the Russians a pretext for a broader military intervention? Or do they sit back and do nothing and watch these sorts of seizures spread? And I think they've concluded that they have to take some action, which is what we're seeing now in eastern Ukraine.
So can elections, which are slated for May 25th, take place under these conditions, especially in the eastern part of the country?
Well, that's going to be, I think, a real challenge for the government. It's important that these elections go forward because if they have an election and it's a free and fair election, which Ukraine knows how to do, they've done 4 national elections in the last 10 years that have been very good by Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe standards. But if they have that election, they then have a president who has renewed democratic legitimacy, which will be important. The challenge is going to be conducting these elections, particularly in places like Donetsk and Luhansk, where they have this concentration of building seizures in probably about 10 to 12 towns. Now, polling shows that people in that part of Ukraine want to vote, that although they may be uncomfortable with the government in Kyiv, they do not approve of the building seizures, and also that they do not like the idea of leaving Ukraine. But I think there's going to be a logistical issue. Can they manage to carry out that election process in eastern Ukraine, particularly if some of these armed groups try to intimidate the people who are running the election panels?
Now, as we've seen this evolve, it's become a dispute between the United States and its European allies on the one side, and then Russia on the other side. Is the West's current approach yielding any kind of results?
Well, the West so far has applied some limited sanctions targeted primarily at individuals. And although the sanctions are quite modest in nature, they have had an economic impact. Capital flight out of Russia is up. The Russian stock market has been under pressure. The Russian finance minister 2 weeks ago revised downward his estimate for projected growth for the Russian economy in 2014. It's now between 0.5% and 0. So I think they've had some economic effect. What they haven't yet had an effect on, though, is changing the course that Mr. Putin is pursuing with regards to Ukraine. And therefore, I think it would have been better had the United States and the European Union adopted some more substantial sanctions.
Right. You use the words modest and limited when you describe those sanctions. This is the way you put it. You said that Vladimir Putin cares a whole lot more about losing Ukraine than the West cares about keeping it. Explain that.
No, I think that there is a disproportionate balance of interest here. But on the other hand, Mr. Putin also cares a lot about keeping an economy going. And if the West got serious about this and started doing major sanctions, for example, sanctioning a couple of big financial institutions rather than small pocket banks, that could have reverberations throughout the throughout the Russian economy. And then Mr. Putin, I mean, we've long talked about this implicit bargain that Mr. Putin has with the Russian people, which is, he's going to keep their political space very constrained. But in return for that, he's going to give them economic stability, growth, rising living standards. And he delivered very well on that from 2000 to 2008. But even last year, when they were projecting that the Russian economy was going to only grow maybe 2 to 2.5% in 2014, Russians were saying, is that enough to keep up Mr. Putin's end of the bargain? Now, does that lead him to alter course? I don't know. I can't guarantee that. But I think there's a significant enough prospect that the West ought to be trying it.
Right, it's clear that when it comes to sanctions, the United States and the European Union are not on the same page. I mean, a month ago when the United States was implementing its first set of sanctions, the chairman of Siemens, one of Germany's biggest companies, was holding talks with Putin in Moscow, at which time he said that we are committed to our long-term investments in Russia. I mean, there are Dutch companies that are involved in Russia. There are British companies that are involved in Russia. So clearly, Europe has a lot more to lose with sanctions than the United States.
No, and I think that explains why there's a more cautious approach in Europe towards the idea of economic and financial sanctions, because the trade relationship that Europe and the European Union has with Russia is more than 10 times as large as the trade relationship that the United States has with Europe. But having said all of that, I'm sorry, more than 10 times what the United States has with Russia. But having said all of that, I think we also have to recognize that what Russia has done with the military seizure of Crimea, you haven't seen that happen in Europe since 1945, where a big power basically used its military force to take land from a smaller state. Now, does the European Union, which I think, to its credit, it believes in rules and rules of the road, does it want to see that kind of challenge to the European order go unanswered? And if that goes unanswered, then what sorts of conclusions are drawn in the Kremlin about other rules that can be broken?
Has President Obama perhaps created another problem for himself here, as far as his credibility is concerned? Because we saw in Syria, he made a threat. He didn't carry out on that threat because he drew a red line, then walked away from it. So is there a problem with his credibility here when he makes these threats towards Russia?
Well, I think they have to be mindful of that. On Friday, when Chancellor Merkel visited the White House, both the President and Chancellor Merkel basically said that if Russia interferes with these elections that are scheduled for May 25, that there will be more sanctions. And I think that would be an appropriate step, but I think a lot of people are going to be watching to see, in fact, if that happens. And certainly the evidence that we're seeing in the last couple of weeks suggests that the Russians are not inclined to do things to defuse or de-escalate the crisis. And my own guess is that the Russians probably don't want to see elections on May 25, because that would compromise their narrative, which says that the government in Kyiv is illegitimate. If they have a good election and there's then a new president, that takes away from the Russian narrative.
What do you believe is President Putin's ultimate aim here in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, certainly Crimea was part of it, but I think if at the end of the day, Mr. Putin has Crimea as part of Russia, but mainland Ukraine goes ahead with the association agreement with the European Union and moves towards Europe, he does not consider that a win. He's very much looking at ways to keep Ukraine from not moving towards the European Union. And so we've seen in the nearly 2 months since Russia annexed Ukraine, you've seen economic pressure on Kyiv. You've seen 2 months of military maneuvers along Ukraine's eastern border. And then in the last 3.5 weeks, you've seen these illegal groups, armed groups, taking over buildings in eastern Ukraine, which I believe are instigated, in some cases led by Russian personnel.
But if you say that it would be seen as a loss by Russia if Kiev continues talks with the European Union in Brussels, is the European Union going to continue talks with Ukraine right now, seeing that the country is clearly unstable? That it is, in the eastern part of the country, completely destabilized to some extent. Is the European Union going to want to open talks with a country like Ukraine?
Well, I think that's a question that the European Union will have to decide. They did go ahead and sign a portion of the association agreement about 6 weeks ago, and they have talked about being prepared to sign the rest of the association agreement after the presidential election on May 25. Now, what that association agreement would do would be opening up a free trade area. It would actually be, I believe, a way to help begin stabilizing Ukraine by, among other things, opening up expanded European markets. Ukrainian companies would have greater access, and that would be a positive thing for the Ukrainian economy, which is in a difficult period at the moment.
Let me ask you a broader question. Was it a mistake for NATO to expand eastwards once the Soviet Union had broken up into the different republics and states?
I don't think so, and I think people forget a couple of things. One is that the idea of NATO enlargement back in the early 1990s was not pushed by NATO. It was demand-driven. Countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, which had emerged from 40 years as captive nation status, really wanted to join NATO as part of their effort to fully integrate into Europe and European institutions. It's hard for me to see how NATO could have turned them aside, particularly when those countries basically adopted the sorts of political, economic, and military reforms that NATO asked for. Now, I think in retrospect, we worked very hard that while we moved down the enlargement track, we also tried to build a NATO-Russia relationship. The idea, or at least our goal being that building such a positive, cooperative relationship between the alliance and Russia, that the Russians really wouldn't mind about enlargement because they would see NATO as a partner. And my guess is that in doing so, we probably underestimated just how difficult it would be to help the Russians overcome their concern about NATO enlargement.
So are we looking at another Cold War here?
I don't think it has to go to that route. I mean, and remember, the Cold War was opposition between two systems. It was political, it was economic, military, ideological across the board. And I think some aspects you're not going to have. But certainly we are headed in terms of Western-Russia relations, unless there's some kind of a change in Russian course to ease off the effort to destabilize Ukraine. You know, my guess is we're headed, and we've probably already entered the most difficult period in West-Russ relations since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991.
Ambassador Stephen Pifer, thanks for joining us, sir.
Having me.